Full crowd.
Thank y'all so much. Thank y'all. This is crazy. Thank you.
All right, well, let's get started. John T., this book is a big departure for you. You've published many books, you've edited many books, you've written more articles than anyone can count, not just for the New York Times, but at one point, John T. had a monthly column in the 3 magazines that cover this region, Southern Living, The Oxford American, and Garden and Gun, all 3 monthly articles. Yet all that time, all those many, many words were always about other people. You turned the focus on other people's stories. You put the microphone up to their mouths. Now, for the first time, you're telling your own story, and I'm wondering why and why now?
There are a bunch of different answers to that question. I think the first that comes to mind is that in 2018, I wrote an article for the Oxford American called My Mother's Catfish Stew. And it was about my estrangement from my mother. It was written as our son Jess was about to go off to college. And I realized that I'd written my mother out of the stories I told him about our family. And I found my want to write her back in. And in doing that, the passage back for me was through her cooking. My cousin had given me a copy of, in my mother's hand, big, looping, cursive, with lots of exclamation points, very much suiting to her personality. She'd given me a copy of that recipe for her catfish stew, which was in turn her father's catfish stew from the Edisto River near Bowman, South Carolina, where my mother grew up. And it was by our kitchen for the longest time. And Blair and I had a conversation one night about this idea that I'd written my mother out of our lives. And we decided in that moment, my wife Blair sitting here on the front row, we decided to include her again in our lives. So we began cooking that stew when friends came. I remember when Kiese Lehman first moved back from New York to Mississippi, Kiese came to dinner. So many people came to our table. So that return to the table with her stew and Jess's departure for college and my want to tell him about the fullness of my story was the first piece of it. The second was that article was published. And my mother, if you read my book, and I hope you do, you'll realize my mother was a woman of great emotional intelligence. My mother was a woman of great social intelligence, but she also had challenges. And those challenges began with alcohol. So after I published that article, My Mother's Catfish Stew, I had people come up to me and say, you know, I grew up in Texas and my mother's drug was barbiturates, but your story resonated with me. I saw some of my own story in yours. And until I had those conversations, including one from somebody I just saw in the audience a moment ago who leaned on the railing in front of our house and told me a story about a gift his father made to him that carried him through his life. Until I had those sorts of conversations, I didn't understand the power and possibility of memoir. I didn't understand the power and possibility of my own story.
You're talking about your mom, brings up the first segment I'd like you to read. I've actually selected 3. I was hoping you could read from the prologue.
Yeah.
And good thing I bought a book, ladies and gentlemen, because John T. came here without one.
So I mentioned that growing up with my mother was tough at times, and this takes you to a very tough moment. It's also an answer. People have been asking me, so this is a food book. I was like, well, read the prologue.
Yeah, right.
So this is the prologue, and it's titled Running. I burst out the screen door, bare feet on gravel. 20 feet ahead, my mother runs toward the dark woods, her red house dress trailing like a cape. She couldn't take another minute inside our house. She couldn't take another minute inside her head. The light from our porch doesn't reach where she's going. At first, I can see the pistol in her hand. But as my mother crosses into the clearing, the red of her dress fades and everything turns black. The crack of that pistol splits open the night. I stumble, catch myself, and plunge forward. Past the sand pile where, just a few years before, I plowed toy dump trucks along pretend roads lined with mud skyscrapers. I find her in the rock garden, among the pink azaleas, beneath a cedar arbor. Mama sits on a bench beside the old jail kitchen that she never quite turned into an antique shop. She cries into her dress. Tears fall down her face. The pistol lies on the ground. Smoke trails from her cigarette. Was that a warning shot? Did my mother push the door open and run toward the woods to fire her pistol into the blue-black sky? Or did she plan to shoot herself? Did she aim above her earrings, change her mind, and crumple to that bench? 5 decades later, I stand at the edge of that memory and peer back in, like I'm watching a scratch print of a black and white film about my childhood. She wanted to make a break. She wanted to make a change. And there's no better way to mark before and after than a run toward the woods and a shot in the night. I ran for a long time too, away from that house, away from my family, away from what my past taught, away from what the South demanded, until finally I turned to face the dark woods.
Whoa. So I think anyone who thinks this is going to be a food book or has some cute recipes realizes that this potential or possible suicide attempts from the mother opening the book is you're announcing to the reader that you're going to go there. And we do spend a lot of time thinking about the mother. She becomes a very compelling and compassionate and tragic and troubled figure during the book. A contradictory character in a lot of ways. She was invested in the lost cause ideology and insisting your family's place as an inheritor of that.
Right.
Sent you to a white seg academy. Also supported equal rights, hung the poster, the Walden poster, marched to a different drummer, and imagined herself on Broadway and loved to entertain people when they came over and was a style maven. So did writing the book help you reconcile your relationship with your mother?
Writing this book definitely helped me do that. I mean, when I wrote this book, at the beginning of this book, my agent sold this book in 2020, and I was still estranged. My mother had been dead since 2001, but I was still functionally estranged from my mother. I'd never been to her graveside. I'd never brought her back into my life. I was working toward it through this recipe, but I hadn't really done that work. By the end of this book, I've learned this lesson, I think, and it's, I think this is true about the South and it's true about families. And I think there are a lot of ways in which my book is basically a metaphor for families and a metaphor for the South all at once. And it's that idea, and we've all heard variations on this that, I love the South and I hate the South. That duality that, Patterson Hood of the Drive-By Truckers has written about. Natasha Trethewey, Faulkner before her have written about that duality. And before I wrote this book, I embraced that duality. My last book, The Potlikker Papers, ends with a meditation on that duality, this idea that you hold both of those things in your head about the South. And then when you listen to people, you often hear them saying the same things about their families. I love my people, but they're driving me crazy, whatever it might be. And so what I've realized writing this book is that to embrace that duality is to leave a soul unsteady. You have no place to stand if you're trying to straddle those two opposite poles. I've learned through this book to love my mother. I've learned to love her again, to bring her back into my life. And in the process, I've always also learned to love the South, to accept the flaws of this place, and to accept that at least in my cosmos, well-intentioned criticism is also an act of love.
A lot of this book is deeply invested in place and setting, and we follow you from Georgia. I think readers in this room will be particularly interested in John T.'s focus on Mississippi and Oxford. We see you getting kicked out of UGA with a 1.9 GPA.
It's 1.8.
Oh, 1.8. 1.8. Thank you for correcting me. Should have fact-checked that. Moving to Oxford, Blair Hobbs, the artist, invited you to visit her class to guest teach, and then her students proceeded to try to get you guys together successfully. So we end up seeing a lot of your time here at the university, including getting involved in a group of students who had the idea to memorialize James Meredith, and you were part of the team that initially worked on that. We see in the book that it didn't go as planned. Another interesting part is we see you becoming a founder of the SFA, and a large part of the book concerns that. I have a question for you about the second part, but before we do, I was hoping you could read a small passage about the SFA perhaps at its highest moment.
Sure, tell me what page.
Okay. This is page 131.
All right.
Y'all, this was the 2002 symposium. John T. in the book talks about this maybe being the height of the symposium. Melissa Hall had just talked about this celebratory activism that they were doing. So I don't know if you want to say a word about that before you begin, but I was hoping you could start reading here and then continue to here.
Okay.
So start here,
Inside our house? Mm-hmm. Okay. I do love this scene. So, two of my previous colleagues with the Southern Foodways Alliance are in the room. I think Melissa Hall's over here. Mary Beth Laster is somewhere back there. I don't know if Sarah Camp Arnold, I see Claire Moss, but a lot of the people who made that organization so successful in that moment and continue to be so successful today are in this room, and I'm so deeply thankful for their friendship and their collegiality and their hard work. I'll read a bit about this. So the Southern Foodways Alliance began really with a symposium that I started in graduate school, and then the SFA evolved from that and attracted smart people like the colleagues I just mentioned. So this would have been the third year that the Southern Foodways Alliance was doing business here at the University of Mississippi and staging a symposium where people were attracted from around the country to come. So that's a long little piece, but
no, it's three paragraphs. Come on, John T. You're a writer.
But starting there?
No, baby, starting here.
Okay.
Inside.
All right.
This is the party John T. is hosting at his house, just to set the scene.
Yes.
After the day's activities and events where people got together and had panels in which they used food as a lens to talk about race and class in the South.
What she said. 4 paragraphs. This isn't that bad for y'all. All right. And it was a symposium on barbecue. Inside our house, 3 men sat in club chairs, waiting for the rain to let up. Calvin Trillin of The New Yorker cracked sly jokes at his own expense. Johnny Apple of The New York Times held a spiral notebook. Blair offered a platter of cheese wafers to Otha Turner, the great fife and drum musician from nearby Gravel Springs, who captured my friend John Martin Taylor's attention during the Saturday night after party near the end of the first symposium. Turner would soon heave up from that chair and march through the crowd playing Shimmy She Wobble on a cane fife. Gesturing toward the round wafers, each bullseyed with a black olive, Blair asked, "Would you care for a kitty butthole?" Like y'all, Turner and Trillin howled. Apple scribbled in his notebook, and Blair went to pull another tray of buttholes from the oven. 3 days later, Apple published a report on the front page of the New York Times. He wrote about the change he had witnessed in Oxford, flashing back to the fight to integrate our school in 1962. And he used that moment to frame the SFA, whose board was then led by Toni Tipton Martin, the first black woman to edit the food page of a major U.S. newspaper. It mattered, Apple made clear, that a black woman was at the helm, and it mattered that we were doing this work out of the University of Mississippi. When we gathered for lunches in the Grove at the heart of campus, in sight of the spot where French journalist Paul Guihard died, we were making change by changing the stories people told of this place. In that moment, we believed Oxford was the most powerful place to do that work. In that moment, we may have been right.
So that excerpt sets up the SFA's work and also how it was kind of reaching its zenith, and you can even feel in that passage a little uh-oh feeling that something is about to change, and in fact it does. So you end up writing with surprising candor about the events of 2020 when people in the organization and outside the organization as well, in the aftermath of George Floyd, decided that a white man shouldn't be the head of the organization and asked you to step down.
Right.
And as a reader, I was really amazed that you were able to talk about such a painful episode in your life. And so many memoirs are opportunities for people to air their grievances or to try to get the reader on their side and dump on everybody else. And you seem to be doing such hard reckoning during that passage. I was hoping that you could talk about what that writing felt like to you.
Yeah, thank you. If you open up my book and look to the fourth or fifth page, really before it starts, there'll be a note on sources. And it includes, my explanation of how I researched this book and my hire of Katie Carter King, who earned her graduate degree here in Southern Studies a few years back, to fact check this book. So everything I wrote here, memory may have been an impetus, it may have been a prompt for some of the scenes I've written, but everything I could, which is almost everything, I fact checked. Using archival sources, genealogical sources, newspaper archives, whatever it might be. So when I reported out what happened in 2020, I was lucky. You remember the James Comey moment when he was interviewed and he said he took contemporaneous notes? That was not that long before 2020. So everybody I talked to, I'd put on headphones and I'd start taking notes about every conversation I had, because I wanted to make sense of what was happening. This challenge to me was such a blind side to me. I didn't see it coming, that I wanted to make sense of it. So those notes served me very well when I began writing this. But I relied less on those than, reading newspaper reports again, interviewing people about their impressions in that moment, and then watching my comeuppance came during a webinar that the James Beard Foundation sponsored, and so I watched that again, which is the hardest damn part of this reporting.
Oh man!
I did because I watched myself kind of fall apart in that moment. But all that was necessary because I wanted to divorce myself of the emotion of that moment. I wanted to revisit the moment and set aside the emotion. I do reveal some of my own anger in this moment. I talk about
not
burning.
Not enough. I thought you were restrained.
Oh, I appreciate it, but I burned a book, Beth Ann.
Well, it needed to be
And
burned.
here we
John
sit
T.
in a bookstore. I burned a book. I'm not angry. I mean, that's the thing. Like, the things I get to do in Oxford, the crowd I see here before me, 2020 was a challenge for me. The question in a moment like that is, what do you do on the other side of that? How do you contribute? How do you learn? How do you move forward? What do you try next? And I got to try something next. This university in this town embraced me and said, hey, you might be able to try something else. And Lord, what a gift.
Yeah. It's a beautiful passage in the book where you talk about Oxford supporting you and people dropping off food and makings of cocktails.
Yeah, Richard Howarth dropped a whiskey bottle on my stoop, and like an hour later, I am not exaggerating, Wright Thompson dropped off the makings of a Boulevardier, like a bottle of bourbon, a bottle of Campari, and a bottle of vermouth. People who know what it means to live in the public eye. They know the way that lifts you up and also the way that can tear you down.
Well, that leads into my next question, and I'm going to warn the audience that this might be my last question. I have several more, but I want to hear from y'all too, so you can be thinking about what you want to ask after I ask, and I have one more thing for you to read.
Okay.
A big theme in this book seems to be narrative and revision. So we meet John T. early in this book where he's living in this historical house where General Brigadier Iverson of the Civil War, who fought in Gettysburg, was born, and it's a big part of their family legend and lore that this happened. And we even see you as a young boy, when people would see the historical marker and come up to the house, you're interested in spinning these stories yourself, and your mom maybe leaves the truth behind a couple times in her willingness to entertain.
Yep.
And then we follow you to UGA, where you would tell the own pledges at Sigma Nu, your own myth making a little bit. And we follow you as narrative shapes your life and the creating of narrative shapes your life, but also we see you revising. And I think that that's one of the great triumphs of this book. And maybe one reason why I admire you as a person is that we see that you are able to understand when your narrative is wrong and do the hard work of like revisioning that narrative. So I was wondering if you could talk about the theme of narrative or revising, and then maybe even answer the question, what did come next for you?
Yeah, so that idea of revision, I realize that's where I excel as a writer. I put crud on the page, many of us do, and you see the possibilities in a manuscript as you revise. You begin to understand the story you're trying to tell as you revise. And, I'm not the only writer to think about their life in this way. I mentioned Kiese Lehman earlier. Kiese writes beautifully about this, and so many other people do. I don't think about this novel as any sort of therapy. I have a therapist. But I don't think about this as therapy. But I do think, for me, writing is thinking on the page. I don't know what I think about something until I write about it. And I don't really know what I think about something until I revise those words. I mentioned earlier the debt I owe to Oxford for allowing me, for educating me. I arrived here, a flunk out from the University of Georgia, earned an undergraduate degree and then a graduate degree here in Southern Studies. I had no instinct to write before I arrived here. This town told me that was possible. Working in this store told me that was possible. But I do recognize that now, on the other side of 20, on the other side of this book, I have a way to contribute to this town, and that's the work I do. Beth Ann's on our advisory board, leads our advisory board for Greenfield Farm Writers Residency. We're working toward building a residency on what used to be William Faulkner's mule farm. The university's owned it since 1990, and it's our attempt to invest in the next generation of writers. And I'm deeply thankful that I get to do that work.
So on the topic of revision, toward the end of the book, you used your skills as a journalist to go and research the things that you had been told all your life about your family to understand what was true and what was not. I was thinking the last passage you could read would either be this paragraph or these 3 paragraphs.
About killing off the general?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, a big part of John T.'s growing up is looking at this historical plaque outside his house and repeating the story. Yeah. Only recent, and toward the end of the book, does John T. actually go back and do this hard research and talk to historians and figure out what the truth was? So I've asked him to read that as his last passage. Just take it, baby.
Okay, you take that one.
Okay, I did.
This?
Yeah, either the last paragraph or these 3.
Okay.
You choose.
I'll do the last 3. There's also a passage in this book when are you going to ask me about this? I can tell them anyway.
Yeah, tell them.
So there's a passage in this book where I go back to a Civil War reenactment.
Oh, that's so good.
That's now being staged in my hometown. It only started in the years after I left, and I went back after I left to go to college. And I went back to visit my mother before she left our house and asked her about it. And I said, Mama, they're doing this Civil War reenactment just up the street. And I said, what do you think about that? And she just kind of, she was smoking a cigarette. She kind of leaned back in her chair and she said, that's just tacky. My favorite part about, it's really my favorite passage in the whole book is when I'm back to report that out. It's 2023 and it's a weekend in May. And I am there among the Confederates with a notebook in my hand, interviewing people, talking to them about why they do what they do. And I'm not making jest of these people. I've met a lot of really kind people who had good intentions being out there. I met others too. But as I was reporting that moment out, when the Confederates were like playing with their toy rifles, shooting people across the field, I checked Instagram. You know what was happening here in Oxford? Gay Pride Parade. Where do you think I belong? I belong in this town.
One thing I love about that, John T., is the difference between fiction and nonfiction. If John T. was writing fiction and he goes back to his house and finds it's the staging grounds for a Civil War reenactment, I would say, oh, come on. You know what I mean? But it happens. The guy living in your house sells
yeah.
like souvenirs.
The guy who now owns the house in which I was born, the home of the Confederate Brigadier General, is a sutler. Anybody know that term? It's someone who supplies an army as they travel. He provides Civil War gear for Civil War reenactors, and he now owns the house in which I grew up. He's very kind to me. I really like him a lot. So I'll read this part, and then y'all ask questions and stuff. The text on the historical marker in front of our house was my childhood scripture. Embossed into iron 7 years before I was born, the words spoke to a boy on a search for heroes. Looking at a photograph on that marker in 2021, though, I saw an error in the first line. Brigadier General Alfred Iverson, CSA, son of Senator Alfred Iverson, was also a brigadier general, and Caroline Good Holt was born here February 14, 1829. The date was right, but the titles were off. A year before, on a trip to Columbus, Georgia, I read through the archives at Columbus State University, looking for details of the elder Iverson's life. Thumbing the notes I brought home, I realized that he turned 60 before the war began. That seemed late to serve, even in a war that strapped both sides for troops. So I called a friend in Jones County who shares my curiosity. He texted a local historian who confirmed the mistake. The elder Iverson never served as an officer, much less a Confederate brigadier general. When the State Historical Commission installed that marker, they ascribed the grandest possible lives to both of the Iversons. The words on that green field were born of exaggeration. They matched my childhood want to believe that the house where I grew up was a place of great import. They echoed the stories my family told about our place in the world. Reflecting the want of much of the white South to believe that the men of the Confederacy were heroes. If facts didn't support those beliefs, the stories they told would.
Oh, so good. Thank you so much, Shanti.
Thank you, Beth.
Let's have some questions from y'all. I see someone in the back. Oh,
yes.
But you're going to have to shout.
You can come up this way if you want.
So when you were talking about the events of 2020,
Yeah.
you mentioned that within like 2 hours of each other, you got a bottle of whiskey on your porch, and then 3 bottles of cocktail ingredients on your porch.
Yes.
So this question is kind of twofold. One, did you use the cocktail ingredients to make the cocktail, or did you just drink them separately? Did you prefer the cocktail or the whiskey?
During 2020, my father was in an assisted living facility up the road, and I made boulevardiers for him with that, and put them in a thermos and dropped them off on his porch later that day. I can still remember talking to my father, and we'd talk over the phone, you know, and you can hear the tinkle of ice in a glass. We'd sit there and talk, except he'd be down the road and I'd be at my house. Those became our cocktail hours, and those porch deliveries were deeply important.
Who else has a question? Go ahead.
Yes.
Was there a pivotal moment in the book where you decided you wanted to be a writer, and if so, how did that evolve into writing about Southern food?
Okay, can I repeat the
Yeah,
question?
please.
Do you want to repeat
No,
it?
you're good.
The question from the gentleman in the front is, was there a pivotal moment in the book in which John T. decided that he was going to be a writer? Second half of the question was?
Yeah.
Second half was?
How did that evolve into writing about Southern food?
How did that evolve into writing about Southern food? Okay.
You know, moving here, I moved here in '95. Moving here, meeting people who were in the Southern Studies program who were right. I remember one guy, Carlos Marino, I believe was his last name. He was from California, and he'd moved here to study the front porch as a social and architectural space. And I met a range of people who were thinking about the South in such interesting and complex ways I'd never pondered. I thought I knew the South, right? I also moved here at a time, think about '95, that's the build up to the 1996 Olympics, which were in Atlanta, as we recall, and there were so many journalists piling into the South, trying to figure out the South, and exploring the nooks and crannies of the South. So that combination of meeting Southern Studies students who were looking in kind of slanted ways, trying to find new avenues of approach to understand the South, and then recognizing that as I read reports from across the South, from journalists who were covering the Olympics, I realized I really didn't know the South. I knew one sliver of the South. I knew the South in which I'd grown up in Georgia, and I was beginning to know Mississippi, but I didn't know the Gullah and Geechee South. I didn't know the sponge divers of Florida. I didn't know so much. So those things drove me to this program, and then landing here in Oxford told me I could potentially write. I sold my first story, which was about Ignatius J. Riley, the anti-hero of Confederacy of Dunces. I sold my first story with an attempt to trace his roots through New Orleans and work a lucky dog card on the streets of New Orleans on a New Year's Eve. And that was my very first magazine piece for the Oxford American. That's the same piece that Blair Hobbs asked me to come talk to her class about.
And there's a question here?
Yes.
Is this Absalom with a more optimistic outlook?
Would you hand me the book back?
Is this Absalom with a more optimistic outlook?
I will give you the sole Absalom reference. So the title of this book is of course, House of Smoke, and that's a title that Blair and I devised one day over pizza and a bottle of wine at St. Leo. Every good idea in this book began with a conversation with Blair. But this book was deep into revisions and heading toward publication when my friend Wright Thompson texted me a screenshot from Absalom, and I use it as a frontispiece for chapter 9, which I titled Reconstruction. So I'm not answering your question, but I'm making an Absalom reference. This is from Faulkner. He must have felt and heard the design, house, position, posterity, and all come down like it had been built out of smoke. So it was a good confirmation that I had a decent title.
Good enough for Faulkner, yeah. Go ahead.
Yes, sir.
I know you referenced it earlier in your speech, but can you a little more about Square Books itself and how it's impacted the book and the journey?
Yeah. So I took a job here maybe a year and a half after I landed in Oxford. I needed spending money and I needed a social life. I showed up here as an older student. I was 32, 33 when I came back to school. And I thought of Square Books as, a place to meet people. I remember meeting Tom and Dorothy Howarth at the front register as they were picking up their Sunday New York Times. I met so many people. I picked up the phone one day and this woman with a kind of husky voice, she ordered Shelby Lee Adams' new book of Appalachian photographs and Bernie Imes' book, Juke Joint. If you know those references, who can tell me who that was? Lucinda Williams, who used references to those books in Car Wheels on a Gravel Road. The social life, whatever it was I began to have, began as people planned events at Square Books or in the bar at City Grocery, and I got to tag along. Square Books became a place for me to learn, but also a place for me to build a community. Stunned into silence. Yes, sir.
Do you know
Yes.
Lucinda Williams?
Do I know Lucinda Williams? No, but Beth Ann does. Wesley.
John T., you described how writing this book reformed your memory of your mother.
Yeah.
When visiting those memories and revisiting those memories, did any of that change your image or perspective of your father?
Yeah. He asked if, in revisiting the memories of my mother, did that change my perspective on my father? And Wesley asked this. My father valued greatly his friendship with Wesley, and and his beautiful wife. That's one of the beautiful things. My father lived here the last 7 years of his life, and he made friends. Many people in this room, he made friends with people I wasn't even friends with, and then I became friends with him, people like Wesley. It's a great gift. My father, the thing I realized, and if you read the book, you'll find a passage about this toward the end of the book. I didn't realize what guilt my father carried for not getting me out of the house in which I grew up, in the community in which I grew up. He carried such immense guilt for not extracting me from a place where violence threatened me and a place that was shrouded in smoke, as it were. And when my father moved here 7 years before he passed, he got to know Blair, and he got to know our son Jess. And he got to understand what a compassionate, smart grandson he had. He fell in love with Blair's art and with Blair's cooking. He re-entered our family on an everyday basis, not a Christmas, an Easter kind of basis, a real everyday basis. And in doing that, Wesley, he got to quit worrying about me. He got to know that I was okay. And I saw him open up like a damn flower, man. He didn't laugh a lot when I was a boy. And then as he grew older, some people as they grow older, they have a tendency to become more bitter and close in. My father opened up, that was such a gift to spend those last few years with him, and for me to recognize that he wasn't worried about me anymore. And it also allowed me not to worry about my own damn self anymore. Thank you for that question. Last one.
Does the show True South have a role in the book? Is there a cameo? Or
It's a great question. He asked if the television show True South has a role in this book. A big one. In 20, when COVID was raging and no one, we thought sports might go away and certainly television shows might go away. Our crew rented a big old rock and roll tour bus and set out on the road to make a TV show. And we made one in my mother's birthplace, Bowman, South Carolina, that place where I mentioned the catfish stew came from. We made one there, and it was focused on that catfish stew. And it included, I mentioned before, I hadn't been to my mother's grave. For that show, we went to my mother's grave. And our director, Tim Horgan, brought a band, Ranky Tanky. They've won 2 Grammys now. My mother would have loved them. She genuinely would have loved them. So I got to visit my mother's grave. We got to throw a funeral for my mother by way of the television show. In that moment, I recognized a lot. One of the other things I recognized, a lot of this book, that opening passage I read for y'all is called Running. And the end of that passage, I talk about I ran from this and I ran from that. And I didn't really realize until that moment in 20 by her graveside that all my explorations, my traveling to New Orleans to write a piece about lucky dogs, my burning up the highway, I told myself I was running towards something, but I'd always been running away. And beginning in that moment by my mother's graveside, I got to quit running away. Thank y'all. Thank you.